I've asked Chantelle, this session is called Creating Your FLLITE Lessons, and it's going to be very hands-on. She's got lots of time for you to work together in groups and work individually on your lessons. But I asked her if I could steal away about 15 minutes to talk a little bit about open education, because you're not just creating lessons. I'd like to kind of take that word lessons and replace it with OER, Open Educational Resources. So let me ask you this question. How many of you have heard of this thing called open education? Now I know Rachel has, because she's attended several of our things. Yeah, okay, good. All right, about half the group. How many of you have heard about the acronym OER? I've said it a couple times, so yeah, you can already say that. Yeah. Okay, so that's a really important piece of FLLITE. The first session of the day, you learned about some of the features of what we're calling a FLLITE lesson. An essential feature of FLLITE is the notion of openness. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that means and how we want you to play the game of open with us, okay? The first thing I want to start off then is by kind of introducing, I kind of set the larger frame, introducing COERLL and COERLL, because we're partnering. We're two national foreign language resource centers. And Chantelle well, I'm going to introduce COERLL, and then I'll throw it over to Chantelle, and she can introduce quickly COERLL, because I think it's important that people understand that where this initiative is coming from. So here is our website, and of course we have open, since that's the most important word for us. It's all about being open. Center for Open Educational Resources and Language Learning. That's a mouthful, I know, right? That's a lot. There are 16 national foreign language resource centers. We're all over the United States, from the East Coast to the West Coast, and we even go to Hawaii. And we've been in operation. The actual congressional mandate started in 1990, and they've been growing. We get our money directly from the federal government. So you got this nice handout, this textbook. You already paid for this, because if you're a taxpayer, if you're here in the United States, this is your money coming back to you. So this is a good thing that the United States government does. We are entirely focused on, in the bureaucratic speak of Washington, they talk about in raising or increasing the capacity of foreign languages for the United States. What we do basically is help teachers and create materials for foreign languages, okay? But even though our purview is the United States, we put things online and they're used all over the world. So, everything now is global, and that really is kind of our reach. COERLL, so I should show you all of the, this again is our website, which is open. You don't have to remember it. You just remember center, that's the C, and OER, that's an acronym, Open Educational Resources. And those two L's, of course, are all why you're here, because you're all language learners and language teachers, language learning. And that's how we pronounce it. You can pronounce it any way you want to. COERLL, 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 I don't care. Okay, so just a real quick recap. This is a website, nflrc.org, and it's the mother lode for free open materials for all your different languages. There are different languages, 70-some languages, so I think we've got you covered. I just wanted to show you, though, the main point here is these are all the different institutions that are represented. So here's COERLL, that's our logo, and here's COERLL. And so let's go to COERLL, and I'll introduce Chantelle. So what does COERLL do?
What does COERLL do? So we're the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language, and Literacy. And so what we're interested in is projects, professional development initiatives, and materials. We also publish a lot of the free materials that are accessible online that look at the intersection between language and culture, and that's where this literacy really comes in. And so the FLLITE project, which brings together culture and language, which is something I think you've already seen in the discussions we've had this morning, is sort of the perfect union between the kind of work that COERLL focuses on and the kind of work that COERLL focuses on.
So coming back, FLLITE, oh yeah, you're going back and forth. FLLITE is then a joint project with COERLL and COERLL. We joined forces, but it's more importantly, it's a project that we're trying to take into the grassroots. So we want all of you to join us. And we also want all of you to become open educators. So you may not consider yourself an open educator yet, but hopefully by the end of these 2 days, you will, and I'll explain that. So let me give you a couple videos. I'm not going to do a PowerPoint, but I'm going to show you a couple of videos. I'm cheating. And this video was commissioned a couple of years ago by the Department of Education because we were trying to explain what is this concept of open education. It's a 3-minute video. Interestingly enough, it was produced by a PR firm in South Africa. Because again, this is a global initiative. And let me just get in a nutshell what I think it is the notion of trying to create an infrastructure by foreign language, or by, not just foreign language, by educators for educators. Okay, so there are a lot of problems in education, and instead of waiting for politicians or somebody else to solve the problems, we're going to solve the problems ourselves.
Education is vital. It enriches our lives, sustains our communities, and helps us grow into the future. At least, that's the idea. Truth is, education as we know it is failing millions around the world. Take Tando, for example. He's a bright kid with big dreams, but the education he's getting is holding him back. You see, Tando's school can't afford the latest learning materials, so he has to work with textbooks that are completely outdated. To make matters worse, Tando's teacher is also left using outdated information, often without even realizing it. And even if he manages to overcome this and gets into college, the cost of all the lessons, books, and notes he needs will land Tando in a pile of debt. It's not just Tando. This situation is being replayed in schools and colleges all around the world. So much for education for all. So how can we fix things? The answer lies in open education. Open education is a global movement that aims to bring quality education to teachers and students everywhere. The basic idea is to put top-notch learning materials on the web that anyone can access for free. You see, unlike textbooks, open ed resources can always be revised, so they're never out of date. Teachers are given free license to adapt them and improve them, giving students exactly what they need to achieve their dreams. As all open ed resources are free to share, schools are no longer limited by where they are or how much money they have. And if you think open education doesn't make the grade, think again. Open ed resources are being created by the world's most respected institutions and scholars. Open education is changing lives. Visit creativecommons.org/education to learn more.
What were some of the problems that that was a 2-minute video. So what were some of the problems that educators are facing?
Out-of-date resources.
Okay, out-of-date resources. When textbooks get published, they're almost always out of date. So, you know, right. What else? And they're very expensive, and they're becoming even more expensive. At the University of Texas, or now the average college student pays $1,300 for an annual textbook fee. That's a lot of money. And particularly kids who are coming from low or moderate income families simply can't afford it. In public schools, the situation is really pretty bad because there are classrooms without enough, textbooks to go around. They're 10 years old, and so forth and so on. Okay, so you know the problems, right? So what did they say? Of course, the solution is open education. What is that? What were some of the ideas behind that? Yeah.
Accessible to everybody.
Yes, so we're going to put these materials on the web to make them accessible. They're not just on the web, they must be accessible. Yeah.
Less expensive because it will be almost free.
Yes, so they are, when I say free, they're not free to make, but they're free for you to use. So we're being subsidized by the federal government to make these materials for people, for learners wherever.
I think they also shareable.
Because some are copyrighted. You can't. There is that site, Teachers Pay Teachers.
Correct.
Whereas I think these, you can use the stuff and you don't have to pay for it.
Exactly. So it's not simply that it's free, it's not simply that it's accessible, it's that they carry something that's called an open license, which makes them shareable. And that's very powerful. If there's a lot of stuff on the internet, right? There's a lot of free stuff on the internet, that does not make it an OER. All of your lessons must carry an open license, and we'll be talking about that later on tomorrow, okay? And how to put an open license on that. And why would you want to do that? Why would you want to share this with the world? By the way, how many of you have ever created a lesson plan? Everybody. How many of you created a quiz? And how many times are you thinking, okay, I need to write a quiz on pretérito imperfecto? I mean, how many thousands, hundreds of thousands of quizzes have already been made? But they're locked up in your classroom because you never really thought to share that. Maybe you do share it with a colleague down the hall, right? But think how powerful that would be if you could share it with the world. That's open education, okay? So we're trying to overcome a number of problems. Now, I do not want you to think that we're here to bash public commercial textbooks. Commercial textbooks can do a lot, but they can't do everything. And part of the problem is that we expect too much from our textbooks. Textbooks are by nature generic, and they're static. They're going to go out of date. They're made by somebody who does not know your students. You know your students. So I think your job is to adapt. No, you're not going to write a textbook from scratch. That's way too much work. But your job is to take what's there and build on it and to make really engaging materials for your students because you know what your students like. So let me show you another video. And I think this video, when I saw it, because I have open education on the brain, I have it on my mind, I saw this video and I thought, OER. Okay, wow, isn't that a great video? So I saw that video and I immediately thought of OER, and I thought of parents are the only ones who really know what their children need. And and by the way, I mean, I started thinking about this in this little video, and I went and looked at, there are a lot of videos that they interviewed the parents. The parents were blown away by her reaction. They knew that she would probably be very excited to have this new doll, but they had no idea how profound having something that was commercially produced, this little doll, that was adapted in just the way that resonated with her. So the point is, I think you are like parents to their children. You are teachers who know what your students need. And so stop expecting too much from textbooks. Textbooks are generic. They're going to explain things in a generic way, and that's good. You can build upon them. But there is a huge piece of the puzzle that only you can fill. Okay? Any comments? Any? Isn't that great? Yeah, right. Yeah, good. Well, we were talking about the affective filter and all that, so yeah. So that's a piece that is and the other thing too, I started thinking about this. This is, these parents are great. They really realized that their child needed something, and they acted on it. They did it. So I was thinking, okay, let's really drive home this analogy. I think you all have a responsibility to make materials that resonate with your students. So figure out what your students like. Ask them, they can help you make these materials as well. You don't all have to do it all by yourself. Okay, so we are joining forces with all of you, but we've already started to join forces with 3 people in particular. I want to identify them here as our collaborators. We're calling them COERLL collaborators. So Natasha from the University of Houston, Marcelo and Carol. Where's Carol? Yeah. Raise your hands, you guys. Yeah. Okay, those 3. We've already made contact with their grad students at higher ed institutions, so University of Minnesota and University of Houston nearby. And how about just real quickly telling us what your text is and kind of some ideas that you're knocking around. Because we want them to become models so that they can go back to their institutions and say, look, I did this, I made people cry, or whatever it is, okay? So, COERLL, how about starting us off?
Yeah, no problem. So Dr. Mandy Mankey showed me this project, and the 1004 supervisor at our university in the Spanish and Portuguese department was thinking of doing kind of a curriculum overhaul, trying to incorporate this idea of literacy in the classroom. So we've been talking about how to do that. And so I wanted to use this workshop and this opportunity to create something that would be useful for this curriculum change. So my specific topic that I chose, which I think is geared towards student interest and specifically within Minnesota, the globalization of food and food production. I also wanted to tie in metaphor because a lot of my students and a lot of, I think when I've talked to other people about this, their students struggle with understanding metaphor and understanding that metaphor is how we understand things and how we conceptualize the world.
I was actually thinking about that as Chantelle was talking at the last session. She was using so many different metaphors.
Mm-hmm.
So metaphors are in the everyday. They're
Yeah.
not this literary trope, this special language for literature. They're everyday, which is exactly what we're trying to do. The literary and the everyday.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I worked with Dr. Mandy Mankey and Dr. Sarah Mack because I wanted something that would be useful for us as instructors at the university. And so the text that I picked is a poem by Pablo Neruda. It's La United Fruit Company. And so it's got a lot of cultural information that I think is interesting to students, specifically tied to the United States and its relationship with countries in Latin America, as well as metaphor. The metaphors in this poem are food-based, so they're like juicy and sweet, and so they're really tangible metaphors. And so that's what I chose to use and focus on.
So we'll give you a chance to show even more of that, but I just give us a taste. So you gave us a little taste for that. Okay.
Yes.
Marcelo, how about telling us what have you chosen? What's your text?
Yeah, well, as I said before, the first time I heard about FLLITE, it sounded like very similar to things I have done in my classes for a lot of years, So actually, for this project in particular, I reused something I have used already in several classes, and that normally with American students, was really interesting to them because it was connected to religion. And it was just this picture I took in a church in Chiloé, in the south of Chile, that, as probably, in these little churches, little towns, a lot of times people leave messages for saints, for the Virgin. They even sometimes leave like teddy bears, objects, pictures of the echoes, of their babies, etc. So I took a picture of a little letter, that was written by a girl to God, asking God that, please God, make this guy fall in love with me, So he asked me to be her girlfriend, for the graduation dance or something like that.
Okay, so I like that because it's completely different than hers.
Totally.
Hers was a published poem. Yours was your own picture that you took of something, some
an
realia.
anonymous text. Mm-hmm.
Perfect, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And Natasha, if you pass it over to her, again, real quickly, could you summarize what yours is about?
Okay, as I said before, I have reached a little bit in the literature in the language textbooks, especially while making a master degree in University of Alicante in Spain. So I decided to develop several lessons using literature, specifically poetry, written by women, Latin American women, because what we see at the books, usually they are literature by men, the most famous, Garcia Marquez or Neruda, Vargas Llosa. So I developed those activities, and the one that I chose for COERLL is with a poem by Gioconda Belli, Desafío a la Vejez. And it's a poem where a woman says how she looks at her her life when she will get old. And basically, I think this is an interesting topic for stimulate the empathy with all generations, and this is important in the Hispanic culture, Latin American, and in Spain. We have this kind of relationship with our old people, and I thought this interesting to talk about that in the class. And also, we see some grammatical things hard for the
of course,
students.
You're your language
There's
teacher.
subjunctive.
Right.
That one, this is a chance to review the subjunctive mode and also to stimulate the metaphorical competence.
They have already started on their lesson, but the whole point is for us everybody to give each other editorial feedback so that they keep improving it. And at some point, we hope that they will then submit it, get editorial feedback from our team, our editorial team, and then eventually, because what we want are really good lessons, right? Not just something that you do the night before, then hand in. No, there are a lot of archives full of junk. We don't want junk, we want good stuff. And it takes time to really kind of get your ideas to cohere and get them to work. So we're going to work with them and then have them publish, but they're going to publish with an open license so all of you can be inspired and can use their materials. So that's what we're doing. We're creating teams of people who will upload their fantastic work, and then you can use them because they're shareable, because they carry an open license. That's an OER. So it's not just creating a lesson, it's creating an OER. Okay, so that's the big idea. I've given you a handout here. Everybody should have one of these. It summarizes what I've just said, and on the back, it also says where you can find OER, because that's what you're now really thinking about. Gee, this sounds great. Where can I find this stuff? And also, how do I build them, and on and on and on and on, okay? And finally, if you want more information, go to the COERLL website. We have a link that says Open Education, and I showed you just 2 of those videos. We have a lot more. Okay, so now Chantelle.
Yeah.
All right.
There's also, I noticed out there on the table, in addition to a number of other resources, a guide of all the LRCs, since you mentioned Carla as well. There are 16 of us, and we each have a profile with links to our websites as well as the main website, if you have a chance to peruse that later. The video with the little girl was kind of perfect, actually, for where I wanted to start out, in spite of the fact that it started to make me tear up, which is a mean thing to do before someone's about to present. Because one of the things that the girl said when she reacted was, you know, she looks like me, right? So part of the power of the doll and that was that it was adapted to her, but that it also made her see herself as part of a community rather than being shut out from it in a way that I'm going to interpret, and she had felt wasn't there before when she had all these other dolls that didn't look anything like her, right? And so I think even though we saw at the beginning today when we were each describing our different contexts that we teach in really different kinds of contexts, and depending on what class, what level, whether we have external exams like the AP was mentioned a couple of times that we're held accountable to, I think one goal that we all share in common is that when we're teaching our students the language and the culture, that we want them to become participants in some way in this public and community life that the language enables, right? That can mean a lot of different things. It can mean reading literature, it can mean going and participating in business classes, it can mean studying abroad, but this participation, kind of seeing themselves as part of that, is something that's really important, whatever our other specific objectives are. And that's something I wanted to kind of start with, because I think with all of the things that we were discussing this morning, that's kind of the big picture, right? And so the question is, what role does the literary play in this? There's been a lot of work recently, and we've mentioned multi-literacies or sometimes literacy-oriented language teaching, and a lot of those approaches take their starting point as exactly this. We need to prepare learners to participate fully in this public and community life, whatever else that might mean. And a lot of those approaches emphasize what has been called textual thinking, and the idea is that we need to prepare them early on, kind of lay these seeds, lay this groundwork for the advanced levels. And the question is, going back to the bicycle metaphor, right? How do we give them the right kind of support early on so they can make those big leaps towards the advanced levels rather than kind of falling over or teetering over when they get out there? And I think what literariness as a concept, what I call literary thinking, adds to this textual thinking is that we want the students even when they're at that early level where text is sort of an impossibility because they don't have the cohesive devices, they don't have the language to kind of create longer texts, that they're starting to get this sense of alternate realities, of the ways in which language is often not crystal clear, not unambiguous, but kind of messy or playful or metaphorical or symbolic, as some of you have pointed out, and that they're getting the sense that meaning is something that you can create, that you can do different things with. And I think one way of thinking about this is it's a kind of ABC approach, and the A is the things that we tend to hold dear that have been kind of prioritized in a lot of traditional textbooks, like accuracy and appropriateness, right? These are important. Accuracy and appropriateness are important, but, and that's the B, we also need to think about the C things, like creativity and choice and criticality, and that we can bring those together in a sense. And that's where this literariness comes in and helps us to achieve that big picture goal of allowing them to participate fully in all of these different levels of life in the language. So what we want to do in this second session today is really turn it over to you to create the kinds of lessons that Carl was describing. So we're really going to be focusing on the pedagogical, and you're going to be doing a lot of the work, but hopefully as good educators also need scaffolding, right? So we're going to provide a little bit of scaffolding for how to create these lessons, and we're going to do it in 3 steps. And the first one is the choice of text. We'll talk about that in a second. The second one is what I call reading for teaching, and you've actually already been kind of doing that, what we did with the Hemingway lesson at the beginning, where you read it and you thought about, what do I notice here? What can I do with this text? What's going on there? That's sort of a reading for teaching, but I'm going to provide you with a little bit of meta language to help guide that as well. And then we're going to talk about how do we set up a pedagogical sequence, right? A lesson, a series of tasks that are integrated in the way we were talking about this morning, and that's where these pedagogical acts that I'll talk about later come in. We'll share it all. Yeah.
Everything will be shared, everything will be posted on our website, so what you're seeing up there, all those videos, all of that, that's great. Keep taking notes, that's probably good for your memory, but just know that you will have access to that PowerPoint. And by the way, that PowerPoint is also called an OER, because PowerPoint, you can make a PowerPoint and you can share it, and it actually, I don't know if you noticed, but it had a license on it, so we're actually practicing what we preach here. Anything that you can use for teaching purposes can be an OER, as long as it carries an open license. Okay.
If you want to go ahead and have it as a reference, this handout here that had the objectives and the very short agenda, which I hope everyone has a copy of still. If you turn to this page here, creating FLLITE lessons, those are the steps we're going to be going through right now. And in a couple of minutes, we'll start filling out what's on the next page where you start to develop your lesson around your text. So this first step is the choice of text. Now, sometimes that's a real choice, as in you go out and you find a text, and for whatever reason, it feels like the perfect fit for what you want to do, or it feels compelling, or you think my learners are going to be engaged with this, they're going to love this, and now I have to figure out how to make this something that has educational objectives. That's kind of open choice. Sometimes the choice is less of a choice. If you're working with a textbook, or you're working with a set curriculum, or you teach in a multi-section course, or you work with colleagues where you all have to teach the same text. So sometimes there, your choice of text is already dictated to you, but nevertheless, this step is important because it's the moment where you say, why this? What am I going to do with this? How does this tie into my course and my objectives? And what can I make out of this text, right? What can I exploit from it in a sense? And so I want to give you a couple of kind of guidelines of how we've thought about these choices, also to give you a sense of how wide the range of text can be, because this morning we've looked at one specific text, and then I'm going to set you free, and that's where you're either going to work with the text that you already have, or you're going to go find a text. So one of the ways, we've talked about these categories of play. One of the ways that we've also thought about the literary and the everyday, and don't worry about holding on to these, there's not going to be a quiz at the end, right? This is really just to kind of open your mind about where you might look. Is we've thought about the literary and the everyday along 3 domains. And this is back on that website under approach, if some of you are following along online. And if not, it's there for a reference. So the first is the literary and everyday genres. And this is where some of you in the groups I know had mentioned things like postcards or graffiti or advertising. I think music videos came up somewhere, that there are these everyday types of texts, even other things like political speeches, right? You'll often find literary type language that you can make use of in these genres that are not literature per se, right? Not the kind of high literature. And so this is one place to look for the literary in the everyday. The second domain that we've broken up to is literary production about the everyday. And we've had one really good example of that already, which was the Hemingway text, right? Where you have a literary author who is also a journalist, interestingly enough, who's writing about something, okay, maybe isn't exactly an everyday, but he's using this newspaper-like genre. Some of you were talking about the genre play, to talk about a situation. Sometimes you also have texts that are really just talking about mundane everyday life, but using literary language. And that's something else we can work with. And then the third is a little bit broader, and that has to do with the ways in which the literary infiltrates everyday life. And my kind of go-to example for this, because I live with a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, is Harry Potter. If any of you have ever been or know of the fact that in London, some of you might know the Harry Potter stories, it's important that they enter the magical realm at platform 9.5, right? 9 3/4, there you go. And in London, you can go and visit the site where there's platform 9 3/4 and you can take a picture in front of that. So the literary kind of bleeds into the everyday. But we see it in other spaces, like I think it was it Rachel earlier who said, I volunteer as tribute, right? So the ways in which we allude to and cite literary works, such from the Hunger Games, right? And in order to kind of shorthand meaning, now you have to recognize the allusion, but if you recognize the allusion, it means something. Another example I've seen recently in a lot of current events, and on the FLLITE Facebook page, which we'll point your attention to later today, there's some examples around the Brexit vote of Britain leaving the UK. I've seen also recently around more national tragedies, people sharing poetry across social media and across Facebook sites. So these ways in which we, in our everyday life, not in some kind of dusty corner in a library or a literary studies class, but in our everyday life, use literature to kind of interact with the world. So all of these are fair game. All of these different kinds of domains in which the literary and the everyday plays out are fair game. We also wanted to highlight the range of texts, and we're only going to be able to give you a taste. This is one of those things where the mouse works the opposite way than my mouse works. There we go. And if you are on the website or if you go to it later, you'll find under components a section that's called texts. And this is a work in progress that you can very much contribute to. But you'll see text for us, in the way we're using it, doesn't just mean written text. It means that as well, but it also means visual text. We had anime mentioned earlier. It means things like music videos. It can even mean a song or an audio text, right? So there's all kinds of different modes in texts and all kinds of different genres. So we might have something like a fairy tale, which if you teach certain languages, if you teach French, I think if you teach German, at some point you're going to teach a fairy tale, maybe some of the other languages as well, right? It's a very familiar classroom literary genre. But we also might have things like graffiti, right? Or street art. And we also might have things like internet memes, right? Which is a popular kind of literary type genre that's circulated through social media. And we might also have things like films, right? That have a literary and the everyday aspect. So the range of genres is wide, the range of domains is wide, right? And you're gonna have to think about your context and your curricular objectives and your needs in order to think about what makes the most sense for you to work with. We've got a huge range of texts, everything from folktales to songs to informational texts, some more kind of cultural descriptive, a whole lot to work with. What I'm going to ask you to do in the next section, and I'm going to kind of give you some concepts to work with, some terms to work with as we do that, is to just pick one. I know some of you have kind of started developing a module, which is great, but I want you to focus in on one, or even for some of you, if you have a longer text, you might even want to just zero in on one section of that text. Because I want you to really do what we call close reading, right? I want you to really go in there. And part of what I'm asking you to do is to go from the more intuitive, which is usually how we find our text, right? This looks interesting. This fits a grammatical concept that I know I have to teach. This fits a theme that I know is in a unit that I'm teaching. And to kind of look at, well, what in the language can we exploit in a positive sense, right? Where's the play in the text and how can we make use of that? And in order to do that, we're going to do this reading for teaching, right? We were doing that in a very intuitive sense this morning, kind of looking at it and saying, what do I notice about the text and how does that relate to my teaching context? But I'm going to give you a couple more terms to work with. The terms themselves aren't important. It's that they're forcing us to pay attention to different kinds of levels. Whoa. And those are the textual level, the experiential level, and the interpersonal level. And I'll talk about those each a little bit more in detail, but you also have the descriptions in your handouts. And so the textual level is these channels through which communication is carried out that make something a text, right? A text is not just kind of a salad of words. It's not just sort of a random stream of words. Once we have a random stream of words and start to give it meaning, it becomes a text, right? So something about language that makes it hang together and become something meaningful and become something bigger than just a stream of words, that's what we're looking at with this textual dimension. And so the questions might be, when we're thinking about play and trying to attune ourselves to play along this level, are what strikes you about the text? What stands out or seems odd about that? And we were doing that this morning with the Hemingway text when a lot of you were saying, there's something weird going on with the pronouns, right? There's something weird going on with the narrative structure of it, right? We're thrown in the middle and then we have to find our way out. That's not normally how you tell a story. That's an interesting way to tell a story. Those become something striking about the text along this textual dimension, and that's something that's being played with. And that's something we can then exploit for language learning. So that's one level I want you to be paying attention to, right? What's going on there in the language? What's striking, weird, unusual, odd about it? The next level is the one that I think our students are sometimes best at intuitively, and that's the interpersonal level. So that has to do with language users and their relationships to one another and their purposes. So that's language users as in us interacting with the text. And that's also interactions between people that are represented in the text, like we had the dialogue in the Hemingway text this morning. And this is related to, many of you are probably familiar with the modes, right? The interpersonal mode and actful, where students are interacting. It's related to that, but part of what I think is important in a FLLITE approach is that even when we're reading something like a short story, or reading a Pokemon map description, or we're listening to a song and maybe reading the lyrics of that song, we're still interacting with that text, so there's an interpersonal dimension there as well. And so the kinds of questions we ask to look at this plane are, how does the text make you feel? That's why I say learners are often intuitive about this. Often if you kind of just give them free rein to react to a text, people will say, that's interesting, or that's boring, or I liked this, right? They're reacting to something on this interpersonal dimension, and then we need to get them to be more specific. So you might also ask questions about, do you feel addressed? Some of you were noting that you felt confused, right? With that Hemingway text, that might have made you feel a little bit not addressed in that moment. You might have felt like, I'm not the person who's in that context and can understand things. Although, of course, as a good literary author, he eases you into it. And then also, is there evaluative language, right? Is there language, in the Hemingway text, for example, we had that one little example of it, because most of it is that straightforward journalistic prose, but we had the one little example of the swear word, right? And calling that guy a cabron, am I saying it correctly? Or should I not say it at all? Okay, right? And calling a guy that, he's evaluating that individual, right? That's not a neutral term, right? And so this kind of evaluative language also tells us something about this interpersonal level. Is that being played with in interesting ways? Is that being exploited? And then finally, what's sometimes called the experiential and is sometimes called the ideational level really has to do with the theme. And that's something we're often good at as language teachers as well. Often our textbooks are structured along thematic nodes, right? We're talking about family now we're talking about the kitchen and eating, right? So that's something we're also familiar with working with. But looking how that's expressed in the text, what kinds of experiences, what kinds of ideas, what kind of perspectives, points of view, or beliefs are expressed. Maybe also whose are kept silent is something to keep in mind with this one, right? Who doesn't get to talk, whose views are not expressed, and what times of action are represented. Is a lot of focus on talking or thinking or doing, right? And this is going to matter for also the kinds of language that you can exploit. So what we're going to give you probably a good 30 to 40 minutes, I'll kind of feel out the room, is I want you to just take the text or one of your texts or a part of a text if you have a longer text, and think along each of these, maybe paying the most attention to the questions, right? What do you notice there? What's interesting about that text? Because that's going to set us up for what can we exploit, what can we make use of when we start constructing lessons. And in order to guide you along, you have, again, here in the handout, you have a space to kind of do some note-taking for that. So I think for the sake of time and for the sake of also giving you lots more time to keep going, I'm not going to ask every group to report back in the way that we did with the texts. I wanted to do it there so we could see the kind of real wide scope of activities, but I wanted to pick up, kind of listening in on groups, on a couple of things I noticed that were coming up again and again, and that might be kind of important to highlight, and then see quickly if you have any questions or comments. And then we'll start talking about the pedagogical acts. But one thing that some of you were starting to notice is that if your first impetus was a particular grammatical form, that sometimes you in the text hit a wall. And part of the reason you might have hit a wall with that text is because that grammatical form might be present in that text, but it's not really played with in any interesting way. And so you ended up kind of not sure what to do there. And sometimes you can think your way into that sort of sideways by bringing another text in as a pairing. We were talking over here about if you have a kind of fairy tale narrative and you want to bring that in because you're talking about the past tense. Well, the past tense is very present in a fairy tale narrative, in a standard narrative, but it might not be very playful. But if you compare that text with another sort of text that maybe does something else with tense, then you can start to see the play between the couple of texts. So sometimes you have to kind of think your way in sideways. Another thing that a couple of people, I think, were noticing as they were working with the text is that sometimes if you started filling out the chart and you were going on these 3 dimensions, one of the dimensions was really hard. You sort of thought, I don't know what to say about this. I'm kind of drawing a blank. And that is itself a piece of information, because it's probably telling you that something more interesting is going on in one of these other dimensions, and that might guide your lesson. So we were looking at what is kind of a love song, right, over here in Spanish. And one thing that we started to notice was that there's a lot of interpersonal. There's a lot of the second person. Even the choices of the verbs are these sort of verbs like want and love, and describing this situation and this relationship between the people. So the interpersonal got really interesting really fast. Textual, I don't know. I mean, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about that because it didn't seem as striking. Well, that tells us something. That tells us about maybe this is a really great text for when I want to do something about first person pronouns and I want to do something about this interpersonal dimension, but it's a less good text if I want to talk about cohesion and really focus on this textual domain. So sometimes the text that we first think we want to come to, once we start reading for teaching, isn't the right fit, right? And that's part of this process of discovery. But what it forces us to do is notice things that we might direct our learners to. Now, what I probably wouldn't do, unless I were teaching linguistics or if I were teaching teachers, is bring a chart like this to my learners and say, look for all these dimensions, right? This is an activity for us as teachers, right? We have to do that close reading, that really engaging with the text first. And then we have to step back and say, okay, well, how do I help the learners find their way into that, probably with a more familiar vocabulary, right? And that's what we start to do when we start talking about the pedagogical acts. So these pedagogical acts, again, what is our goal? Our goal is really to foster reading, writing, yes, but also speaking and listening and viewing as well, and doing this for meaning. So meaning is really important. Meaning is a driving force. Also understanding these texts as socially, culturally, and historically shaped. So we have to bring in things like critical thinking, things like function, what is this text doing? And then also an awareness of how this meaning is designed and redesigned. So we have a lot of things that we're accountable for. And what the pedagogical acts allow us to do is to kind of break that down. And so this is another kind of tool for thinking as a teacher. And these come out of education, specifically from the New London group, who in 1996 wrote an article that kind of launched in education the literacy turn, a focus on literacy. And it's been in recent years really influential for foreign language education. And I know in a couple of the groups this has come up, so I just want to highlight it. There is coming out of ACTFL a series of webinars that have been put together by my colleague at COERLL, Beatrice Dupuis, that are on literacy and language teaching. And I'm going to try to find the link for that by tomorrow so that I can share that all with you as well, which will kind of also give you another way into thinking about this approach. But the idea behind the pedagogical acts, it's a way of us noticing what we're doing in the classroom, what those choices are, why we're making them, and when. So rather than having a strict sequencing where we have to start with this activity, and then we have to do this activity next, and then we have to do this kind of activity next, the idea is that there are always these choices that are present, and how we integrate those, how we string those together into a coherent lesson, depends on what our objectives are, depends on where our learners are, and so these become purposeful choices by us noticing which choice we're making in a given moment. And so what this diagram, I'm going to talk about each of these pedagogical acts in a second, but what this diagram is meant to indicate is that they're interconnected, right? There's this integration that we had talked about earlier, and they're not sequential in any particular way. The sequence is up to you as a teacher as you decide how they fix together into a coherent lesson, right? So it's more like Lego blocks, right? You have them and you can use them in different moments, but they don't have to go together in any particular way. All right. So the pedagogical acts, they kind of fit into 4 quadrants, but each of them has 2 sides, right? And I think that'll make sense why they have 2 sides as I go through them. And as I go through them, I think you'll also notice that they're kind of probably stuff you're already doing in the classroom. And so part of what they're meant to do is serve as a reminder to bring in that variety, to bring in that richness, and that purposefulness when you make the choices. So starting over here at the top, experiencing the familiar. This is where we enable learners to draw on their life world, right? The world in which they live, their understanding of it, and on their previous knowledge and experiences. So I'm gonna use your example over there because it's perfect for this. One of the groups here with French was working with the story Beauty and the Beast, right? Many of the students in our classes will be familiar with that very story, and if not, definitely the genre of fairy tale, right? So you're letting them draw from something that they've already experienced before, something they already know.
And there's another good example, the Pokemon example, which is like everybody's talking about Pokemon. In fact, it's Pokemon Go. It's the new version of Pokemon. So she's like completely familiar, focusing on the familiar.
Yeah. Well, and maybe that's even an example for the other one as well at the same time. The other side of that coin is that we also want them to experience things that are new. If all we did was showed our learners genres that looked kind of like English but in this other language, then they're never learning that also sometimes these genres, sometimes ways of making meaning look quite different in another language, right? Folk tales in French are often different than the American versions that they've learned before, right? So we want them to also be immersed in these new experiences and unfamiliar experiences, right? And that we need to do both of those things, right? I'm going to move down this way, conceptualizing. So one of the things we do is conceptualizing by naming. So sometimes that's where we have a concept, an abstract term, where we're supposed to categorize, compare, contrast, notice something differently. That's what you've all just been doing, right? I gave you a set of terms, these tools to think with, and said, find things that fit into these, right? So you've been conceptualizing by naming. We've had a name, we're naming a concept, and then you're trying to find things that fit that concept, right? And this is something we also ask learners to do. But sometimes we also ask them to conceptualize by theorizing, and this is what many of you know already as inductive learning, right? Where we're giving them something and saying, what do you notice about this text? Can you categorize what's going on here, right? So we want to make sure to come at this from both of these angles. And then analyzing functionally. So sometimes we're analyzing a text or a practice or an image or an action to understand what it does, its causes and effects. So if we're looking at something like the pronouns that we had in the Hemingway text, right? We might first be looking at, well, what does a pronoun do? So if I have a word like they, well, it shorthands the Russian and the Mexican so that I don't in a text have to keep saying the Russian and the Mexican, the Russian and the Mexican. It also creates cohesion throughout a text, right? So that grammar has these important functions. But also they have critical effects, right? And this analyzing critical has to do with, well, if I call someone the Russian and the Mexican rather than saying Jose and Vladimir, right? That immediately has a very different effect for how I'm constructing these people as individuals, how I'm naming them, and that has a sort of different kind of critical effect in the text that we might want to get at as well. And then moving up, applying appropriately and applying creatively. And this is, again, key to proficiency, which has come up in a couple of different ways. We want the students to also be using the language, and that means a lot of different things, but we know we want them to be doing that. And we want them to be using it appropriately, right? And this is where textbooks often kind of put their weight, right? This is how this is used in such and such culture. This is predictable, this is typical. These are the ways you could expect a person to react if you do this. If you use the formal you in this context, people will think you're being respectful and that will be good. If you use the informal here, people will think you're being disrespectful, right? However, we also want them to apply these things creatively, right? To use them in new ways that they haven't used them before, and maybe that aren't even typical or anticipated in the context in which they're going, right? Because this is how we make new meanings. This is also how we assert ourselves. So sometimes maybe purposefully using the informal, like if you're swearing at someone, that's often how it works in German, right? You might have a stranger and you might use the informal exactly to say, hey, I'm putting you in your place and I'm knocking you down a notch, right? Maybe that's not exactly what we want our learners to do, right? But we do this all the time with language. We use these things creatively to kind of create different relationships, different kinds of meanings. And so these are all very important. Now, how they fit together often has to do with what you're asking those learners to do. And so that's where we're going to try to kind of break out again in groups and get a bit more specific. So what we'd like you to do pretty much for the next stretch of time, and then we'll come back a little bit after 4 to debrief, is to use that space at the end of your handout for starting to create a lesson. Now you might have in your context, and I've heard this from a couple of people, other ways in which you need to talk about these pedagogical acts. If that's the case, I would encourage you to use this vocabulary just as a starting point, and then to work into the vocabulary that you need to use in this program, in your program, because again, this is for you. So if you have specific ways of structuring a lesson that are required of your context or your program, feel free to try to bridge into that. But this next step is to start setting up how are you going to work with this text, right? Where are you going to start them out? How are you going to make sure that all of these different angles are somehow integrated into a lesson?